Hello my friends, hope you are well. Today I'm back working on my Kitbashing 40k Swamperial Guard army, and I'm giving our little green men their first bit of heavy support in the form of a bombast cannon. Bombast? Yeah, I don't really know how to pronounce that. Anyway.
She call me Mr. Bombastic.
Swamp miniatures.
So I've got this field ordnance battery set, and I'll be building the first half of the unit today, going with the artillery piece for some nice indirect fire support for our infantry. And as I was building this, I was quite impressed by the amount of movable parts it had actually. There's not too many models that have this feature, so it's pretty cool, although I probably won't have any use for it, so whatever. But obviously this artillery piece, as cool as it looks already, doesn't have much of a swampy vibe to it, so we need to give it a bit of extra love to have it fit in with our little ramshackle swamp army we're creating. I'd bought this Crud Creek Blood Bowl team a while ago to use some of the Snotlings as minions for our larger green men, but these barrel segment parts of the pump wagon really caught my eye when checking over the sprues and looked perfect as some makeshift artillery cladding. Of course it doesn't really make sense that you'd attach some busted old wood over a big old thick metal plate on the front of your cannon, you know, what extra protection is that really going to provide? But our goblin boys are not necessarily the sharpest spoons in the box, and they'll use whatever they can find to bodge up their equipment and increase their perceived combat prowess. I use a few more of the pump wagon pieces to make a little sheltered frame around the top of the cannon, because nothing stops a high velocity aerial attack like a thin bit of wood. And then I stuck on these wheel pieces too, to look like some nice fancy goblin hubcaps, which I think really completed the look. And is that not pretty freaking cool? I think it's still recognizable as the Cadian bombastic cannon, whatever, but it's definitely got a makeshift goblin swampy look to it now, and I was really pleased with how it came out. This piece alone had made me really excited about all the different possibilities for the vehicles and heavy weapon support I'll be making for this army, so there's a ton of exciting builds to come, but I'm getting ahead of myself, so for now let's crack on with some crew members to operate our big gun here. The kit bashing for the artillery crew was really simple, to be fair. I had some leftover Gretchen heads from the last video, and I just combined these with the Cadian bodies from the field ordnance set. If you saw the first episode, you'll know the headcanon for our goblin boys is that the ones that grow to be the largest are viewed as superior to their smaller brethren, and as such are given the more important combat roles, like leading squads and operating the heavier weapons. So our battery commander, the gunner, and the loader have all been built in line with this logic, and they'll be completing all the important jobs for the effective firing of this artillery piece. But they can't be expected to do all the grunt work as well. For that, we're going to need some of those little green minions I mentioned a while ago. Now, these Snotlings are literally so tiny and adorable. If you thought the Gretchen shock troopers I made in the first videos were tiny, then have a look at this side by side. They might be the miniest minis I've ever seen, and I just love them. The little nose pick one is probably my favourite because it reminds me of myself. And the Snotlings are basically the pawns of the goblin divisions in the swamp army. They're supposed to do what they're told and assist with all the menial logistical work involved in swamp warfare, but more often than not they can be found scampering through the food stores, ingesting their own weight in mushrooms and fungi, and just causing general mischief. So how much use they'll actually be to the artillery crew is up for debate, but they're pretty cute and funny, and that's the most important thing. Anyway, I'd spent some time working out roughly where all the minis would be placed, and once I had a layout I was happy with, it was time to do some painting. I'm starting with our big boy gun first, and I'd prime this in black to make painting the metallic pieces a bit easier, but before I do those, I dry brush the wood in areas with some white so they'd be more receptive to the contrast paint I'd be using later. The main area is getting a nice metallic sheen with the breech and the barrel of the gun, as well as the adjustable struts at the back and the various little cranks and handles scattered about. And I was using a gunmetal colour for this, as it's a bit darker than your typical kind of silver metallic colours, which would have looked a bit too bright down in the murky swamps. I then use a darker purple, Xerius purple in fact, to paint on the big shield piece at the front of the artillery, as well as the main carriage of the gun and the little feet pieces. And I'm using this instead of the shyish purple contrast paint I use for the soldier's armour, as contrast paints and large flat surfaces go together about as well as a rabid chimpanzee and an angry goat. Next up, I sloshed some Cygor brown contrast paint onto all of the wooden details, which work well with these textured pieces, but looks a bit darker than I'd hoped. So I gave those areas a quick dry brushing with a couple of lighter shades of brown to get it looking closer to what I had in mind. There were a bunch more little metallic details I'd left until the wood was painted, so I touched those in next and then started the grimification process with some Nulnor going onto anything with a metallic sheen and some Agrak Surfshade going onto the wood to give it a bit of extra depth. After that, it was time for everyone's favourite rust effect paint to make a special guest appearance, so say hello to the Dirty Down Rust, everyone. I only used this for the first time recently in the Fallout diorama I'd made of the Master, but since then I've been using it every chance I get, and I like to slosh it on pretty heavily, then come back in with a damp cotton bud to get rid of any of the excess and be left with some pretty realistic looking rusty corroded metal. Very nice. And that was the main heavy lifting for the cannon done. All it needed now were the usual finishing touches like brightening the wood back up, adding some edge highlights to the purple pieces, painting on this little targeting lens thing and the computer screen, and just touching up the metallic areas where the rust had gone on too heavily. So not a very sophisticated paint job by any means, and I really haven't done anything difficult here, but I genuinely love how this cannon is looking right now. I think this might actually be my favourite thing I've ever built and painted so far. I don't know, I just love it and I think it looks really good. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that's enough of my self-congratulation. I'm sure someone in the comments will tell me this is the biggest pile of shit they've ever seen. But yeah, let's move on to our little green men now. I won't talk too much about the painting process for these, as I covered it in the first video and don't want to end up boring you all to death, so go back and check that out if you want to know more about the specifics of the colour choices and the painting rationale and all that good stuff. But just as a quick refresher, I'm using contrast paints for the main three colours to make army painting a bit more streamlined, and those are Karandras Green for the skin, Shyish Purple for the armour and weapons, and Rattling Grime for the fatigues. Before I started this army, I was quite kind of avoidant of contrast paints because I'm not the best painter in the world anyway and didn't want to end up dependent on these to get a good quality finish, you know. I wanted to grow my skills and be able to get a really good finish with normal acrylic paints, as I felt that contrast paints were a little bit like cheating in a way. But now that I've been using these for a few weeks, I'm like, what the bloody hell was I thinking about before? These are really good. They're not quite the one-stop shop they're made out to be. I mean, you can use only contrast paints on your minis if you want, but I think that making them one component of the paint job and then using normal acrylics to push it to the next level is the best approach. So with these guys, for example, the Karandras Green gives the skin a nice colour on its own, but it looks so much better when you come back in and use some blends of Moot Green or something similar to that to add some highlights and extra definition. And also, you can't really use contrast paints for finer details like eyes or lenses or the little Aquillas on these guys' uniforms, so you're still better off hitting these with some normal acrylics. My little Snotling boys got pretty much the same treatment as the bigger ones, with the Karandras Green being used for the skin and then painting in the remaining details with some other colours. So some Rattling Grime on any scraps of clothing, gunmetal for the shoulder spikes, and a gold metallic colour for the little trumpet guy up here and any earrings or bits of jewellery. There were a few other details to paint in also, like this big old blue sock thing. I really don't know what this is about, to be fair, but you know what they say about big socks, big cocks. The little plaster on this guy's nose, this mushroom, a nice bold red for the little bands and strappy bits they have, and then the teeth and eyes and everything else. All those bits then got some highlights just to make them pop and stand out, you know, give them some extra pizzazz and style and jazz them up a bit and yada yada yada. But what I really wanted to do was just to ask everyone to take a quiet moment of reflection and lay your eyes upon thine little green butt cheeks. They ended up being covered when I glued them down, sadly. So yeah, just take a look at these bad boys while you still can. But butt cheeks aside, that's all the painting for our actual miniatures done now. I really love how they've come out, but they definitely need somewhere to call home. So let's whip up a little base for them to stand on. I start the base by sticking down a bit of my homemade mud mixture, and once that dries I soak in some watered down PVA to seal everything in and give it a nice damp glossy shine. I still don't have a specific base and scheme finalised for my army, so I thought I'd experiment a bit today and see what we can get going on. I started by dry brushing on some different shades of brown to begin with, which looked okay but not very swampy, so I added some dark green into the mix too, and then also tried stippling some of this on. I then sloshed on a few washes into the recessed areas mainly, and once they dried it gave the impression of a wet swampy channel going through the mud, which I really liked the look of. So I gave it a final light dry brushing of brown onto the raised bits just to lighten those up, and then took out this swampy goo stuff to play around with. I basically stippled a very thin layer of this into those wet looking areas from before, and then used a hairdryer to set it quickly. I was a little bit skeptical of how this would turn out, as I've had quite mixed results with this stuff in the past, but once it dried it looked really cool and it gave a nice subtle glossy green damp look, kind of implying the ground's moist, like all good swamps should be. And yeah, I was really pleased with how this was looking actually, especially considering how easy it was to do. So I got all our minis and a couple of decorative crates glued down, and then also added some of these dumb cane plants, which are probably one of my favourite base and accessories at the moment. I feel like I've said everything's my favourite so many times this video, but they are pretty cool. Anyway, I finished off the base with some tufts of dead grass here and there, and we were now ready for the absolute final detail of this build. The pièce de résistance, the creme de la creme, the macaroni to my cheese. Anyway. Now, all the credit goes to Tekkamania on Reddit for this idea. I'm sure other people have done similar things, but this was the one I saw that inspired me to make this little kind of smoke blast and shell emerging from the barrel. So all I did was take a cotton ball, poke a hole through it with this metal pointy stick thing, shove a toothpick in and fluff it out a bit, and then start soaking it with super glue. And I was using a gel super glue for this, which wasn't ideal as it kind of sat on the surface for a while before absorbing, so a liquid super glue would have definitely worked better as it would just soak down into the cotton a lot easier and a lot quicker. And also I did use like 3/4 of a bottle for this, so it's maybe not the most cost effective way, but I did try with PVA first and it had just turned into a sloppy wet mess, so a fast setting glue is definitely preferable here. Once it had all thoroughly soaked through and had time to dry, I was left with this, looking like something between a kind of stick of candy floss and one of those rotating doner meats you see at a kebab shop, but it was firm to the touch and it was ready for painting. I'd started with a grey originally, but I changed my mind and decided to paint the whole thing in a mixture of yellows and orange first to look like a big old fireball, and then once I had it all covered up, I then came back in and dry brushed on various layers of darker and lighter greys, finally finishing up with a very faint layer of matte white, just to build up a kind of nice smoky blast on top of the fireball, but still have a kind of yellowy orange glow coming out from underneath the smoke. For the projectile, I took this spare artillery shell, cut the top off and began filing it down until I had something like this. I then drilled a hole in the bottom and used some more super glue to attach this to the toothpick. I used a little bit of paint to blend the toothpick in with the surrounding smoke blast and then painted the shell with a touch of metallic paint. Finally, I wrapped some tape around the toothpick so it would fit snugly into the barrel and shoved it right up in there. After a quick bit of Steel Legion drab around the rim of our base, the ritual was now complete and the next addition to our Swamperial Guard army was ready. My friends, what do you think? I literally love this piece so much. I think it might be my favourite thing I've ever made, as I said earlier, and this little project has made me so excited about all the different vehicles and heavy weapons and other things I'll be kitbashing for the remaining kind of 1800 to 1900 or so points in this army. I won't say much more because I feel like I've already spent half this video talking about how much I love the cannon and the Snotlings and everything else, and everything's my favourite, blah blah. But yeah, I'm just really happy with how this one came out, and I'm really excited about working on the rest of this army. This artillery piece is just one half of a field ordnance battery unit. I still have another model to make, and I think the next video I do in this series will be making the second half, which will look very different to this one, so make sure you stick around if you want to see that. And again, shout out to Tekkamania on Reddit for the inspiration on the smoke blast and projectile firing out. This isn't glued in, so you can kind of take it in and out if you want, so you can show that the model's in the firing phase or just chilling or whatever. But yeah, shout out to Tekkamania for that one. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out my channel where I have a bunch of other stuff you might like, and make sure to subscribe or leave a like or a comment and let me know what you think about today's build. I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.